Welcome everyone to this next session. We have Goussier. He is from Austin, Texas, and we've already started great conversation in the backstage. Happy to be with him. And Goussier, take it away.
Sure thing. Thanks, bro. Hi, everyone. How's it going? My name is Gucia, and I'm here to talk about a bit of our journey at Group 1001. It's a hopefully I want to share a bit of our stories, and you'll be able to get some insights out of this to maybe help you drive change within your organization. First and foremost, I'd like to give a bit of explanation of who I am. Firstly, I'm a data enthusiast. I've been in a variety of different roles, whether it be data practitioner, whether it be a manager, whether it be an innovator. And my experiences can really be summed up in three phases. Phase one was really where I was involved in data and BI migrations in large scale enterprises. Second phase was where I was enabling centralized data analytics through managing the enterprise data warehouse teams. So to speak, it's really think like seeing how the sausage was made. And then the third phase, the third opportunity came about where I was able to enable a decentralized data analytics platform using this cloud based architecture, using the modern data stack. And here I would like to kind of talk about experiences from that journey into where I'm at right now at Group 1001. And to kind of give a quick explainer of Group 1001, we're basically a collection of different brands centered around really empowering growth for the different companies that we have under umbrella. We're an insurance and annuity space where we serve almost about a million customers with over 1,200 employees and over $62 billion of AUM. What's very key about our organization is that we believe in empowerment, risk taking, and technology, which ultimately drives the return on capital. I want to pose a question to you all on the audience right here. How long does it take for you guys to go from an idea to an insight? And an idea is in a form of a question that needs to be answered, usually a form of like kind of a business question. An insight is something more akin to like a report or a dashboard or a model that can actually provide you that answer gleaned from those assets. How long does it take for you, for your organization, for your team to handle that for something that's new coming in? I'll be really curious on that front. Feel free to just toss some of the answers into the chat. I would kind of like share a bit of a story for our organization. Late last year, when our business was challenged, and when I say challenged, our business was actually it had a different type of challenge where we had a tremendous amount of growth, almost quadrupling towards the end of the quarter. And our CEO wanted to know had a big problem, and this was led to the question, the idea. He wanted to know how can we optimize the productivity of our organization because our business was quadrupled, our organization was inundated. Optimize the productivity of our organization. So we got involved. We sat down with some of their key counterparts. We identified really flushing out the business outcomes. We flushed out the overall business processes. We mapped the data points. We ingested the data. We modeled the data and ultimately create a form of a dashboard or insight. So what initially none of this existed, right? To be able to answer this question. So from a situation where there's zero transparency to having something in the hands to see the transparency of their operations organization, this took us about 2 days. 2 days from idea to insight, from something that didn't exist to actually having something in the hands to answer that question. However, this wasn't always like this. 2 years ago, it was very different. 2 years ago, we had a lot of fundamental problems from broken data pipelines where issues were arising every other day. We had bad or partial data being reported. In fact, inevitably, when issues occur, and they will occur, we end up spending hours of our time to recover. And by the time we actually recovered, the whole day was gone because it takes 7 hours to recover. So if you would ask me 2 years ago from our organization, what was the idea to insight? It would have taken at least 6 months because we're spending so much of our time getting through the slog of getting through some of these fundamental issues, much less like even trying to answer some of the initial questions, and much less to even answer or bring new data sets to enable a lot of the outcomes. But we knew we had to change. We knew that this could not be the way forward. So we used this opportunity, a blank slate, so to speak. We knew that we needed to drive our own destiny. So we came up a combination of both a short term as well as a long term plan. And it involves, and I'll walk through that plan of what we did. It involves replatforming, taking the new opportunity presented to us to fundamentally change how we handle data. On top of that, we knew what we needed to achieve. We wanted to accelerate the adoption. We wanted to accelerate the ability to get time to market, time to insight. And we knew that we need to create all these foundational components to drive the next business outcomes, to drive the next part of the frontier. So I'll talk more about what we had to do from a replatforming perspective. Let's start with that. In order to replatform, we needed to know what good looks like, where we need to be. And this is kind of like the pattern, the Orwell architecture that we always like think about from this end. When people think about data and analytics, they think of data sources on the left. And what they're looking for, what all the business really cares about, is the output on the right. And it could be in the form of a report, a dashboard, a prediction, a model out there. But as we all know here, being data engineers, we know that it's never that simple where you just take data and just make it become that output. And that's where data engineering is involved, right? So we adapted this diagram from the A16Z's data infrastructure diagram, and we adapted it for our organization, for our use cases. So, firstly, we needed a new data storage, and that's where we brought in Snowflake to actually be our core analytics data store. We know we needed something that's to scale. We know we needed to remove a lot of the operational complexities around managing databases. We knew we needed to automate this at the same time. And then once we had the system to store our data, we needed a way to get data into that said data store very quickly. And that's where we brought in Fivetran to handle data replication. At the same time, we brought in Dagster to handle our data orchestration. So we can get data into the actual analytics platform to then answer and create the analytics output. Third, we actually needed to bring in a transformation layer. And this is where we brought in Coalesce to handle our data modeling because we knew we needed to not just land the data, but to clean, curate, transform, create models that can enable those dashboards in a performant manner. And last but not least, we also needed to manage the data. We need to ensure that there's quality in the data that we produce, as well as to enable cataloging them so that way it becomes discoverable. And the fun thing about data that I always like to talk about here is like data is a multiplayer experience. I think of it as kind of a gaming term. It's a multiplayer experience in the fact that as someone producing data, there will be someone else consuming data. There's usually multiple different consumers. So we're all playing around this same sandbox together, right? From that perspective. So in which case you have to facilitate that multiplayer experience between the producer and the consumer. So this is the roadmap that, or the platform that we were looking to target. And like I said, it's adapted for our organizational needs. And the reason why we chose these tools is we were trying to optimize differently. We were trying to optimize for time to insight, to get value faster, to move out of worrying about the low level concern to more focusing on the higher level tasks, to get value out of data quickly. And the thing about our organization, we knew for a fact that we're not going to do this with a large team of data engineers or a large team of analysts. We knew we need to do this with a much more nimbler, much more smaller team. So the fun thing about this is that our organization, when we first started out building much of this platform, it actually started out as just 4 people. With 4 people, we're able to instantiate this platform to get value quickly, to get that time to insight down to 2 days. So we're bringing a lot of new tools, a lot of new services in. How do we do this? I think what really helped us for each and every one of these capabilities, we needed to do a few things. Number one, we had to identify the key business problems. So yes, there's number one, a plethora of different tools out there in the marketplace. But what you really need to hone in on is what is the key business problem you're trying to solve? You need to map those business problems to innovative solutions. And we knew for a fact that we needed to leverage new technologies. We weren't really looking at the existing incumbent legacy players in this space. We were looking for cutting edge tools that could give us a different type of experience, a different type of velocity that we're looking for. And we knew for a fact what's very important about this, we needed to manage costs and value to really balance it, to be pragmatic about how we're managing the cost versus the benefits that we're getting. And the way we like to think about this is really in the form of the TCO perspective, the total cost of ownership. It's not just the cost of the software. In a lot of traditional enterprises, they only think of the software cost primarily. So they're trying to optimize for software costs. But if you think about it realistically, it's really the cost of the software plus the infrastructure plus the engineers and to and you have to balance that to the speed of delivery time that matters. And what we knew from that perspective as we were doing this, we needed to balance also the consideration of open source versus closed source. We knew that like going back to the optimization I mentioned earlier, we didn't have a ton of engineers to optimize to enable this outcome. We knew we had a small nimble team and we needed to execute quickly. So this is where it helps drive a lot of our decision making of balancing that cost versus value. And then last but not least, you have to enable these new capabilities. And when I say just not just enable, you have to integrate the solutions. You can't just bring in a new product, a new tool, and then call it a day. You have to think about the holistic design. And when I say about the holistic design, it's referring to the overall experience from a development perspective, from the beginning to the end of the output of how you get those insights to your users as quickly as possible. So integrating it in a way that it really facilitates that end-to-end experience. Going into the acceleration perspective, want to talk more about how do we accelerate? So taking a note from software engineering, development velocity is really key. This is something that is coming more into the data space where we're thinking about development velocity, but this is already very much used in this traditional like software development perspective. So if you think about it, if it took us 6 months to deliver insights, then the reality is those business opportunities are gone. We can't let that happen. So, and what happens in those type of situations, a lot of times with larger enterprises, a lot of the actual departments, the different teams relying on the data teams, they end up building their own alternatives. So you can't have a partnership when you're also working on in different directions. However, what if instead of it took 6 months, it took days instead, even hours? So if you reduce the iteration cycle of enabling analytics for your users, then it creates an entirely different engagement model. And that was what we were optimizing for. That was what we were going for. And how this really looks like in practice, it can be done. So I want to show you like earlier what we had as a blueprint for organization and how does it drive that idea to insight in 2 days. How do we dramatically reduce the velocity of each of those steps? First, you have to shrink the data acquisition pipeline. So if we use tools like Fivetran in the modern data stack, we don't have to spend months of engineering resources to procure data, to acquire data, to land into our systems. That could be done in a day or even less. And that makes a humongous difference. On top of that, we need to reduce the amount of time it takes to model, to transform data. What used to be in the past, we used to in my previous experience with EDW teams, a lot of times the data analysts would be building the reports, and the data engineers would be the one modeling the data. They had to do this because there were a lot of strict standards that had to be adhered. You have to ensure that there's consistency. You also have to ensure that it was optimized from a loading perspective, and all of these concerns a data analyst was not necessarily well suited for. But what if we can remove a lot of the friction behind that? And in our case, we actually empower our data analysts to do data transformations. So instead of relying on constant back and forth between the data analyst and the data engineer, we can actually have our data analysts work with the business, understand the business problems, build the data models, build the dashboards to actually optimize around it. And this is where we can actually bring the transformation time down, even down to hours at a time. On top of that, we knew that we needed to change how we build reports. Using tools where we came from, like from my own experience, like with MicroStrategy, as well as like with Power BI, they take quite a lot of time to get going. There's a lot of upfront setup time in order to get those value out of it. From like in the case where ingesting the data in Power BI, transforming it, modeling it within Power BI itself, publishing that data asset, and then creating the actual reports and visualizations on top of it to then create these data models. These take hours of a time for a single iteration. We needed to reduce that. So that's where we had like Sigma play in, where we can actually make iteration changes in minutes instead of hours at a time. So because we gain more time back, what we actually spend a lot more time now is both on automation as well as more on the data management side of the fence. So we can spend more time creating more data quality checks to ensure that the assets we're producing are being validated across every step of the way, and actually spend more time cataloging data sets so they become more visible to our downstream consumers to enable that collaboration for our organization. And the other key thing is, like I mentioned earlier, was like that automation. We need to integrate the tools and the services. We need to streamline the development flow. This is what we actually had to focus on. And this is what we built out with a majority of our team, like I said earlier, for that time to insight, initially with a team of four. Now, our team has grown quite more since, but I'll talk more of like how that eventually evolved. So, one thing that I think for like a lot of you folks in the audience to think about for your organization, for your team, this is what I would think is like the best way of representing the data analytics roadmap for any organization. And this is a data analytics maturity curve that I think represents the kind of the industry as well as how people should think about their team, their organization, their department. And this was adapted from Michelle Winter's talk in at Data Council. This is a very great roadmap for you to think about. And the way I kind of think about this is there's a reason why it's drawn kind of like a pyramid, is that it's kind of like Mount Everest. And when I say it's like Mount Everest, the reason why I put that analogy is because the thing about Mount Everest is that everyone wants to get to that top, that summit, that level 5, to have that AI help them with that, right? So that's the current state of the world where everyone's chasing after these new AI related outcomes. But the problem is most organizations, a lot of organizations are just not suited for that. You can't just simply bring AI to an organization that just haven't even solved basic reporting to enable that. And 2 years ago for us as our organization, we were struggling with even level 1 to even do reporting. But what you have to focus on here is that number one, you have to progress the levels. Just like going like climbing Mount Everest, you have to start at base camp. You have to acclimate, you have to prepare, you have to reach the next level and then the next level and so forth. And only when the conditions are right are you able to summit Mount Everest. The same should be applied for your data analytics maturity of your organization. You need to create foundations that elevate you further to tackle on the next challenge and so forth. And what's going to be important when you think about your team and your organization from a data analytics maturity, you need to try as much as you can to reduce the iteration cycle between each of these levels. If you can reduce them, you can mature it faster to drive that adoption. But to leapfrog altogether, it doesn't really happen in practice. It's a very challenging situation. And this is what I would impress on a lot of you on here is to think about your organization, think about your team, and how you can progress. You're part of this analytics maturity curve within your organization. So, what do we go from here? As I talked earlier, we were able to solve reporting, we were able to solve dashboarding. How did we go? Where do we go next? And the interesting thing for us is that we were able to take a lot of the foundational investments, the investments we made in the data infrastructure, in the data team, the data platform teams, and a lot of the kind of the trust and partnerships we've built with the business. And we knew we needed to approach a lot of key business challenges that actually needed AI to solve. But the thing about AI that I kind of want to talk about first is that We have a more pragmatic approach to how we see AI, and this is kind of like our viewpoint that is interesting. Is the we see that, first and foremost, like we see AI as more of a feature for us than necessarily a product. And what this really means is that we're not just trying to build the AI of XYZ. We're trying to really leverage AI to enable our business. And what this means is that it has to tie into some fundamental business problem that we're leveraging AI to solve, to empower, to accelerate. And what in order to approach this, we need to develop both the data strategy along with our AI strategy, such that we continue that investment in that strong overall foundation. We continue to improve and invest in our data and AI governance, and we build our talent and the use cases towards the platform enablement, so we're able to create basically leverage for organization to drive more out of it. And what kind of like the other kind of principle that we use towards our kind of approach for doing these is we believe more of the fact that we want to drive more of an outcome driven design approach. And what this means is we don't want to do 100 experiment, 100 different experiments related with data science, ML, or AI to then drive hopefully maybe five of those going into production. That results in like a 5% deployment rate. That's not what we need in our organization. We knew that our organization is smaller and we can't afford to spend all that time experimenting with such a low deployment rate. Instead, we wanted to kind of rethink this design such that we can target more of an 80% deployment rate. And what that means is that you really have to do a hard assessment. What is most valuable? What is most profitable? So instead of doing 10 experiments, you do five. So in order to do this, this is where the outcome driven design comes into play. You have to define that business problems clearly, whereby AI can actually help support it. AI is not the solution to all problems. It is the solution to some problems. And the problems that you need to choose, you have to be very selective. So you have to find out what are the key metrics that you're going to be targeting for those problems. You need to find out how you can empower your team to be able to iterate and experiment, because these are very difficult technical as well as functional challenges to organize an organization to enable them. And at the same time, you need to focus on how you execute while balancing the cost of being wrong. And what this means is that you have to pick and choose your battles on how you want to approach these outcomes. Like I wouldn't recommend picking the riskiest outcomes to drive towards this. Rather, picking something that's relatively low risk that enables high amount of ROI in order to drive those experimentation. And if you want to hit that 80% deployment rate, that means you don't experiment 100 times. Maybe you do five, and you focus on getting those four to production, getting them out the door quickly, while at the same time balancing risk. So going back to the original architecture, going back to the original domain, based on what we had initially before, we needed to expand the scope, the domain of which this was covering, from not just a data platform, but also a data and AI platform. And because of the pre-existing investments, we're really extending it forward, adding in AI ML capabilities, such that now we can actually enable those outcomes. So to summarize our journey, 2 years ago, we were kind of like struggling with basic reporting. It's kind of, you want to think about, like it's kind of like the stone age of data going into that. But we built the platform. We spent a lot of time integrating with bringing all the data sets, building all the feeds, building all the automations. And we started focusing on celery reporting, creating better adoption, driving that time to insight down from what was 6 months ago down to 2 days. And then we had opportunities where there were a lot of business challenges where we needed to experiment with RPA to automate a lot of the highly manual tasks, especially around document handling. And from automation, we're able to get more, progressing further in our maturity curve, where we can now look towards the frontier of thinking about or bringing in new capabilities to enable organization to have more intelligent assistants to drive that level 5 outcome, that cognitive analytics outcome there. So kind of to kind of give you an idea of like how to drive some like the culture of innovation within your organization. it's really kind of a flywheel effect. So as your business grows, the more data is being generated, which inevitably drives more questions that have around data, around your operations, around your business. And what's important for you as data engineers, as data analysts on here, as ML engineers too, is to think about how can we drive faster insight? How do we reduce the amount of time from getting that idea to getting an insight out there? Because if you can have faster insights, you can experiment more. You can be able to ask more questions because one question always inevitably leads to more questions. But this gives you more opportunity to experiment, which gives you more ability to deliver better servicing faster, as well as provide better products to your end customers, which drive business growth. And ultimately, this creates more data. So this flywheel effect. And ultimately, right, like data culture is a decision culture, right? So if we can be able to provide more insights, if we're able to use those opportunities within your organization to bring in new innovation, to drive better outcomes, then it creates this area where your organization, where we started 2 years ago, where we weren't really using data to drive our decision making, to now where data is a very core part of our organizational culture. So, what really helped looking back? There are a few key ingredients for success looking backwards. We achieve early wins with our key business partners. And what I would recommend for you guys is to look for who your most important stakeholders are and focusing on solving their problems. And sometimes solving that problem doesn't necessarily need to be the flashiest or the most elegant or solution. Sometimes it's just about getting stuff for what they need very quickly because in the end you need to build trust. You need to build that partnership with them. By building and engaging those stakeholders using data to showing them what the possibilities are, you're able to build that partnership going forward. And then at the same time, be pragmatic about how you balance risk versus rewards. Some organizations are inherently more risk averse. So you need to find ways of reducing that risk exposure while at the same time maximizing value. Sometimes this could be in the form of maybe creating like an isolated pilot to prove out some of the concept. Maybe it's about costs of thinking about how you can put different controls or parameters around it so that way you can drive it. Or a lot of cases is about finding the use case that is inherently less risky that can give you that avenue to drive more of a long-term outcome. And also at the same time, you have to invest in automation. You have to remove a lot of the manual interventions, remove a lot of the manual processes before, because automation is where you're able to get that scale. Like in our case, when we started with just 4 people, we're able to scale very quickly because we automated a lot of the concerns, whether it be from deployment, whether it be from the data quality checks, whether it be from provisioning more and more data assets there. And last but not least, building that innovation culture, right? And this requires a combination of creating that autonomy as well as creating that psychological safety for your team. It's super important that you give and empower your teams to experiment, to learn from failures, and to celebrate the successes. And like I said, it's real, and combining all these factors together is what I've looking back is why we're able to get to where we're at. We had amazing partnership with the business, amazing partnership from stakeholders as well as executive leadership to know that this is the direction we wanted to go because we're able to gain that trust over time. So that's what I would kind of impress upon you guys to think about. And with that being said, I mean, just as a quick takeaway, like there's 2 key things I want you guys to think about. Number one is where are you at in your organization from a data maturity standpoint? Where are you at to really holistically assess? And second of which, how long does it really take your organization to go from an idea to insight? If you find that your organization takes months to deliver insights, maybe it's time to think about take a hard think and rethink how you can actually transform that and looking at the business problems they could use to drive those change. With that being said, that's what I have here. Any questions?
It's a really great question to end on. So we actually have, I think you've already got a lot of people cooking along those lines. And so there's some questions about transformation speed and and automation. So, first off, was the transformational speed increased simply due to the tools being used? What was the before situation?
Sure thing. Going back to, I think this is what you were referring to.
Right.
So the transformation speed, I think what we've done that's different is that we were, like I said, it has to do with how you're optimizing. We were optimizing for this time to insight. So what we found, or kind of like in my, like I explained earlier, was like in the past, what I usually found is this friction usually between a data analyst and a data engineer, where you would have a data analyst be focused on the business problems, be focused on dashboards, but they weren't empowered on the data modeling side. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times they kind of lobbed it over to a data engineer, and then the data engineer will try to figure out based on the data analyst asks to create the corresponding data models. This creates friction. This creates an impedance between what they're achieving, which creates more iteration, more time and lag between it. So what we optimized instead was, let's take the data modeling out of the hands of the data engineer and then move the data modeling to the data analyst. So now the data analyst responsibilities is to understand the business problems, understand the underlying data, create the dashboards. But in order to create the dashboards, they need to build a data model that corresponds to that. And what we found is that by what we use in this case was Coalesce with the tooling, we're able to, because Coalesce automates a lot of the traditional concerns that we had with giving data modeling to the data analysts in terms of naming convention, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
audit columns, in terms of the different templates, in terms of optimizing data loads. A lot of those concerns were automated away such that a data analyst can actually model the data very quickly. And then what this does is that this also has a side effect where it frees up our engineering resources to now focus on integrating and automating the entire like development flow, as well as focusing on whatever all the ingestion of net new data sources that, for example, Fivetran doesn't support, and to build the kind of the reusable framework such that we can create like this cohesive data pipelines across the end spectrum. So for us, it was a combination of like how our optimization techniques were, because we're optimizing for our organizational structure, as well as using the tools, using the templates, using the automations to get leverage out of this situation. That was like the key change from our perspective.
Were the automations, so the automation steps, was that happening in Fivetran and Dagster?
Fivetran and Dexter, correct. A lot of
Okay.
times, like we automate using combination of Terraform. Like we're trying our best to do as minimal as possible using the UI itself, but using the actual Terraform to automate by code to drive change. Same goes on Dexter. When we're ingesting or bringing in data from, like, let's say SQL Server environment, instead of creating one-for-one jobs, we can actually use like asset factories. So it becomes more of a metadata driven approach where you can automate and scale out for hundreds of data feeds or table feeds instead of writing it one by one. So this is where we automate a combination of the deployment area as well as automating within code itself, so we can actually achieve the scale that we're looking for too.
Okay. And then you mentioned there were 4,000 plus tables deleted. Was that based on your desired outcome?
It wasn't deleted per se. Let's kind of review that. It wasn't deleted. What we actually did, we had 4,000 plus table feeds brought into the actual data platform.
Okay.
This was done over a span of about, I think, a year and a half. So it was a combination of replicating all the underlying data sources that we had, supporting our operational business, as well as bringing in net new sources, whether it be from external file feeds or other external data providers and so forth.
Cool. Uh, so there's two questions that are kind of related. First, so the first and then the second one kind of build on it. When would you um, have independent teams curate their insights or self-serve versus having a dedicated um, data analyst serving those users?
That's a very good question. So let me kind of touch on that a little bit. So in kind of the structure that we would have to go about, the way I kind of think of it is that there's really two types of teams, and I wish I had a slide on here. I should have put on here, but it's really a hub and spoke design. So you actually have the data and AI platform team managing the platform concerns. And this is around managing the infrastructure, managing the integration, managing the deployment, managing the automations, right? Creating the reusable frameworks. And then on the spoke itself, it would be really more on kind of the data analysts primarily, and as well as some data engineers to help support that. But they would be organized by departments, by function. And the reason why you want to organize around that is the fact that you want them to be highly engaged with the business, to have all the context of the department or function they're working on, so they become their own expertise in that area, and then they're using the core services, the core tools to really drive those outcomes. That's the way I would highly recommend from that, using this hub and spoke design.
And so following up to that, uh, so your approach as a data team was to provide a data platform that other people could use to generate insight. Did you build user management on top of the platform? I think my interpretation of that is usually that's referring to data literacy, training, upskilling, that kind of a thing.
A little bit different. So I think the short answer is no. We did not drive in that approach where we created like an abstraction layer where it is
Mm-hmm.
you have this all-in-one interface. However, I had thought about that. Like I would think this hasn't really come up in the marketplace, but to think about like an overall data portal where you can actually access all of this doesn't really exist right now. But what we did instead is we actually pushed down. So they're actually using the tools itself. We offer training across all these different tools. And in terms of from a user experience to explore data, this is where we kind of lean on a catalog solution, where you can actually discover data assets and know, what reports are being built, like what data assets are there, where do I find it, who's using this, how is this data constructed, can I trust the data, as well as like seeing the overall consumption and usage graph there.
And
So
then
that's kind of how we balance it right now.
while you have this slide up, there were some questions, and I think they were answered, but just for the sake of the recording and anyone watching, in your ingest transport section, you've got that blue logo is Fivetran, and then the sea creature is Dagster.
That's
Is
correct.
it, is it an
The
octopus?
octopus is actually the Dagster icon.
Okay, then you've got Snowflake for storage, and then the flower slash seashell, that's Coalesce.
Yep, this is
Right,
Coalesce.
those are your two. That was
This
your
is
tool stack.
Snowflake.
There's a
This is
couple of
Fivetran. This is
perfect,
Dagster. We use
perfect.
Soda for data quality, and this is Atlin over here.
Oh, down at the bottom. What did you have for data quality?
We use Soda for data quality,
Soda for data
and we use
quality.
Atlin
Atlin,
for our data discovery.
fantastic. Uh, do you have a sense of what the percentage distribution of cost was between ingestion and transformation?
That's a good question. So I think the distribution so far for our organization, which is going to be different, right? It really varies depending on your organization. I think one of the things I will say that we have an advantage in our organization, we don't necessarily, the data volume is not the biggest problem. The problem is managing data. So a lot of our costs on the ingestion side is actually relatively small, I would say, in terms of ingestion versus transformation. I think the ratio is closer to more like 40% here. I would say it's more like 50-50 actually. It would be 50-50 between the ingestion and transformation side. And the transformation cost will really be on kind of like the query performance, the run times of it, like how much performance it takes to load the data on an ongoing basis. That's the way I kind of think of it from our end. But like I said, this is different based on each organization. The nature of the data we're dealing with is more wider. So we're dealing from more data variety of different data assets that are not as large in overall depth of volume, which is why, like in terms of our costs, are quite different there.
Great. So next question, pivoting a little. How would you manage a situation where information is very siloed, um, like to the extent that your stakeholder is hoarding the information? Like you can point to the specific person that has the information and they're not really interested in putting it in the pipeline, right? They want to keep it in Excel or whatever the situation is. How would you manage that situation to implement analytics projects based on that information?
Good point. I think this is what comes back in here. You have to have the right stakeholders. And I can't emphasize this enough. You have to find the people that, like what we started out initially, we found stakeholders that, number one, were much more receptive, that had a lot of challenges, a lot of problems, but they were willing to look for help. They were looking for ways to help drive those operational efficiencies. Now you would be able to find key representative stakeholders where, if you that are, you're going to find those that are more willing players, solve their problems, enable them first, celebrate with them, make that public so other people are seeing the innovation that's happening with that stakeholder. What ends up happening is you're also creating this interesting cultural dynamic where other departments and other areas also feel that, maybe why are they not getting served? Why are they not getting the value of these situations? This FOMO effect, it also helps you towards building the partnership with other stakeholders. Now, ultimately, you're not going to be able to convince everyone. There will be ones that are more difficult to work with, and what I'd recommend is finding using the leverage, that network effect between all of the existing parties that can help drive that outcome to ultimately drive that stakeholder, that more difficult one that you're trying to work with, where that data is being siloed, to ultimately open up that data with you. And at the same time, it's really about winning the hearts and mind. You have to bring them into the fold, work with them, solve their problems, like win their heart overall. Show that you're not trying to take away all their effort. You're trying to help them. You're trying to optimize
Hmm.
them. Those are very key important areas. Is that you're not taking away jobs with these. You're trying to help them. You're trying to make them more efficient. Maintaining a spreadsheet every month is a terrible problem to have. I don't think they really like that. There's a lot of the other challenges that they've been stuck at that they weren't able to do because they're spending all this other time maintaining these manual processes. So that's what we've always found to help work, is like convincing them in that fashion, in that way. I don't know. Does that help
But
answer?
no, it does help them, right? Help them succeed, right? When they succeed, you succeed. I
Exactly. When
agree. I
they
agree with
succeed,
you.
you succeed. Celebrate it openly, and that creates an interesting dynamic there.
So when the project started, was governance in place? So I read that as, did you have Atlan in place, or was that something that you implemented in the project?
No, governance was not in place holistically as our entire organizational. Like, if I ever think about governance in a traditional sense, where you have a holistic data governance strategy and
Hmm.
practice within your organization, honestly, we didn't have any. We had none. So we were kind of in an interesting situation where, as a data team, we were pushing for data governance. We were pushing this because we knew that we were dealing with information that had a variety of different levels of sensitivity that we needed to manage, because we needed to sleep at night knowing that we've done everything we already did to ensure that our data is managed well. We knew that the exposure that we're bringing forth as we're creating these dashboards were managed, tracked, and observable. So this is where, as a data team, we brought in Atlan selfishly to help us get better control out of our data in terms of identifying PI, tagging them, tracing the lineage around it, um, going back into like that multiplayer experience. For every data asset you produce, is I don't know. This is maybe a hot take, but every data asset you produce is inevitably kind of tech debt that you incur. So
Hmm.
usually what happens with a data team, you spend like 100% of your time developing, producing data assets. And if over time, when you're supporting the reports, supporting the data models, supporting all of the different things you produce, that equation starts to shift, whereby you're no longer doing 100% development. You're doing like 20% development. 80% of your time is supporting the existing stuff you produce. So we brought in Atlan to help us kind of mitigate that, to reduce that transition, where we're not spending 80% of our time maintaining the systems. We're spending more, so like hopefully like 20% of our time, you know, maintaining the system, and more 80% of our time driving new outcomes. So we were bringing this in to really help us, Ashley.
Thank you. That's great. So you mentioned Atlan. Were there any other data governance tools? I don't want to like turn it into an Atlan commercial. Or what other tools kind of would you include in your data governance platform?
Well,
Was
I
it
mean, there's
mostly
really,
Atlan?
I think there's, in terms of like, I think of it not just in data governance, but overall data management. What do you need? You need to know
Mm.
data quality. You need to know the discoverability of that data, of knowing where that data asset is, how is it being used, who's using it. And what's also another key is like thinking about data privacy, to know what are the most sensitive data assets within the organization, where's it being used, how it's being used. I think the combination of all of this is what drives overall the kind of like the data governance spectrum within the organization. So there is one tool I haven't put on here, but there is another section about data privacy and security, of ensuring that your PI assets are secured, are governed in a way from a data access perspective, and tracked and traced to ensure that there's no inadvertent data access.
Where's next question? For someone transitioning from data analyst to data engineer, what skills side projects would you recommend working on?
That's a good point. So if you're transitioning from a data analyst to engineer, I think you have to focus on the end to end. I think a lot of times as a data analyst, we're so focused on just the dashboard creation, the visual aspect of it. But you see in this diagram from this roadmap, it's much more involved. You have to think about how you're modeling data. You need to look at understanding the kind of like the core principles of, for example, Kimball data modeling, the dimensional data modeling philosophy. And as a side project, what I would focus on is a full end-to-end side project where you're focusing on landing data into some form of a data store. You need to focus on showing how do you land it, like how do you bring the data in, how do you structure it, how do you roll it out, and at the same time, you need to think about how do you validate the data. So that's what I recommend using something of a side project that is more near and dear to you. That's something that you're highly motivated for, whether it be kind of had a question. Like for me, it's like thinking about what sort of for me, it's like thinking about I like the investment problem. So if I need to figure out where am I going to invest in terms of real estate, well, I need to get some information about the real estate data. So I need to find a way of procuring some form of real estate data by zip code, by city, by state, and to see and then land that and then model it and transform it. So you need to find a use case that makes sense to you, that question that you want to solve, and then build it end to end. And then once you build it end to end, you'll be able to get a lot more knowledge out of it as a result from a side project perspective.
Last question, and I actually have to hop off to moderate the next session. Um, so when I hop off, it won't end the session, but you'll see me disappear. So I want to say thank you before I go. This has been fantastic. I've loved it. And I'm not the only one. There's multiple comments to that effect in the chat that I didn't have time to share. But the last question that I see in the chat, how does automation and considering trigger criteria affect how you think about executing on the data modeling? Does it change anything?
Trigger criteria. So I'm going to assume that the trigger criteria is like thinking about how do you kind of orchestrate the assets, meaning
That's
that
that's
do
my
I
that's my thought
land
too.
the data first and do X, Y, Z? Well, honestly, that's always been a challenge. That's a tremendous challenge, and I think this challenge is a fundamental problem with the way we've done data pipelines in the past. We tend to think of it as, for example, if I need to refresh this dashboard, right? I need to be able to model data, I need to land it, I need to trigger it in sequence, and then manage the cron and cron scheduling. uh, that is not the right way in a long-term sustainability. Ideally, what I've seen going next is this asset-based modeling where you actually see a dependency graph of the fact that this particular dashboard depends on this XYZ data model that's in your mart that is coming from this Fivetran data that's being replicated. That full dynamic asset level dependency is what you're seeing like a lot of like Airflow 2.0 as well as like Dagster bring to the umbrella, where you're not thinking about how am I scheduling this from like run task A to task B. You're thinking about what asset do I care about, and then when do I need to refresh it. So I just need to be able to focus on the n+1 problem from a triggering perspective there. So this is why a data orchestrator, if you haven't really thought about that, is super super critical for your data platform, because you cannot rely on like a cron schedule here and a cron schedule here to get your data assets. You need to think about the cohesive execution of that, and that's where data orchestrator as a category is super vital for having a really strong data platform. Well, great. Well, that I guess that concludes our presentation there. Thank you everyone for attending. Really appreciate it. Hope you all have a good one. Thank you all.